Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. I feel like this is probably an unpopular opinion, but I don't really care for the Dragonflight talent trees. I'll go over why exactly that is in a moment, but first let's have a very cursory history lesson of talents in WoW. Initially, back in vanilla, every class had 3 talent trees that they could invest talent points into. These of course aligned with all of the specializations of those classes, but technically speaking, there was no such thing as, say, a fire mage. Simply players who had invested the majority of their talent points into the fire tree. The trees were all divided into rows, with you needing to invest 5 points into the tree as a whole to access each successive row, with there sometimes being specific requirements to access certain talents. Aside from those restrictions, you could allocate your points however you wanted. Usually there were major abilities unlocked at the 11, 21, and 31 point spots, and so a 31/20 point build was very common. Though capstone talents were sometimes abandoned in favor of the 21 point talents in a secondary tree. Most of the talents were pretty basic in nature, such as increasing crit chance or reducing cast time. A single effect was also often spread out over 5 points, such as by having each one give a 20% chance of triggering it. Weird builds could and did occur, but normally players stuck fairly close to the obvious point distribution. 2 rows were added with the Burning Crusade expansion and another 2 with Wrath, respectively adding 41 and 51 point talents, though of course you could still create more unique builds, such as the Frostfire build during Wrath. The system was appealing because it gave you a reward every level that was usually simple in nature, but which made you feel like you were growing stronger. It benefited from leveling being a fairly slow process still, which made every level feel meaningful. A common criticism was that these talents offered the mere illusion of choice, which, although not always true, often kind of was. There was often little to no wiggle room in optimal builds. Also of note was that changing your talents in any way involved a considerable cost that discouraged you from doing it too frequently, with Wrath adding dual talent specialization that let you have 2 builds that you could switch between freely. The merits and drawbacks of these restrictions are discussion worthy, but I'll likely make that the topic of a different video and not expand on it here. Cataclysm made specializations an actual technical thing, meaning that spells could be locked to certain specs innately instead of locked off through just the talent trees. Concern over bloat and infinitely growing trees also caused them to scale talent trees back. Most formerly 5-point talents were compressed into 2 or 3 points, making each one more significant, and the capstone talents were set at 31 points, with 41 talent points being available overall, although you could not sink more than 10 talents into secondary trees. Talent points were now awarded every other level, starting at 10. Although not super popular, this version in many ways feels the most similar to Dragonflight talents. Mists of Pandaria marked a massive shift in talent design. Gone were the sprawling trees of the past, and in their stead we were given 6 rows of 3 options available every 15 levels. At first these were uniform across a class's specs, with talents merely adjusting their effects and tuning a bit based on your specialization, though later expansions would make some choices literally spec specific. At any rate, it greatly streamlined things for players. Although your choices were greatly reduced, those choices were made to be far more meaningful. And because each talent was directly competing with 2 other options, they could be balanced in much more of a vacuum. Not entirely, because other talents could naturally impact their value, but still. And each row usually tried to offer options that served a similar function. For example, the first mage row let you choose between Presence of Mind for a free instant spell every minute, Blazing Speed for a short but intense movement speed increase every 25 seconds, or Ice Flows for a free mobile cast every 15 seconds. All of them, in different ways, were mobility options. Other rows might deal with defensives, crowd control, or more rotational abilities. As a general rule, talents in the same row were tuned to be on the same power level, with the caveat that active abilities had a higher potential output than passives, which is fair. I personally always tended to favor passives as they helped to avoid cognitive overload and were often just as good when you take into account human error. Talents could also be swapped out far more readily, simply requiring you to be out of combat and to use a cheap consumable like Vanishing Dust. This model largely fixed the illusion of choice problem of the old trees, was less vulnerable to ballooning over time, was very intuitive to understand, and allowed different players with the same specialization to feel quite distinct from one another. A 7th row was added in Warlords of Draenor, but no more after that, as character growth shifted more towards borrowed power, which is a discussion we're not going to go into here. Suffice to say that while it's not my favorite thing in the world, the player base really overblew the issue. The next major shift in talents and the system we currently utilize was introduced in Dragonflight. Blizzard decided to go back to trees, but drastically shook up how they operated. General class talents and specialization talents were split into 2 trees, with points awarded in alternating fashion as you leveled up. Every talent now unlocked more specifically by maxing out a preceding talent, although these paths often crisscross to give you options. Trees were also cut into 3 rungs, with the second rung requiring an investment of 8 points to access, and the third rung requiring 20 points. This would sometimes encourage players to spend some fun talents early on, instead of racing straight to more blatantly strong talents lower down. There are also still the occasional choice nodes that function a bit like mop talents, though only between 2 choices. Controversially, a lot of basic class abilities were taken out of the spellbook and shoved into the trees. While this was sometimes a good call as it created a choice, it was sometimes blatantly to just fill the tree out. Overall, they certainly accomplished the goal of giving you sprawling trees that you could fill out with an infinite amount of potential builds you could make. But as I stated at the start of the video, I have major misgivings with it. Firstly, to an extent, it brings back the illusion of choice problem. Although I think there are a greater diversity of builds than with the vanilla trees, there are many cases where you're meant to decide something in either the right or wrong way. Most overtly were certain cases of abilities being moved from the spellbook to talents, such as basic interrupts, or abilities that are so core to the spec and the rest of the tree that you'd have to be clinically insane not to take them. Although I did just recently find out that the current optimum build for shamans has you skipping over purge if you don't need it for something specifically. And I'm sorry, but that's just stupid and should never ever be the case, Blizzard. Secondly, Dragonflight talents have brought about the most rampant ability bloat most specs have had in many expansions. Because every talent is only 1 or 2 points, and really only a small number are 2, but we have 61 to spend, we wind up sinking points into often over 50 different talents. And very few of those have mundane effects like 2% more haste. Most add something more convoluted, either modifying how your spells work or granting you entirely new abilities. And because active abilities don't require much of a talent investment, it can be difficult to justify skipping any that aren't out of reach. Granted, you probably shouldn't take all of them because it's unrealistic that you can juggle them all optimally, but that can be a very hard line to draw, especially when guides are telling you otherwise. The result is that it's very easy to wind up with overly convoluted rotations, crowded action bars, and almost fluff-like upgrades to the rest of your spells. Thirdly, these talent trees were addressing a problem that doesn't really exist anymore. The main allure of vanilla talents was that they made leveling, a fairly lengthy process, feel rewarding at every interval. And while it can be a bit boring to go multiple levels without any new tools for your new character, we really don't need something every level anymore. Leveling is stupidly fast, and at any rate, a slightly more rewarding leveling experience is just not worth it if it results in a needlessly convoluted endgame. I empathize with players who make leveling their main form of gameplay, but for most players, having a bunch of upgrades while leveling is incredibly irrelevant to the bulk of their game time. Funnily enough, the Profession revamp sort of succeeded better on recapturing the feeling, as it gave us a gradual form of progression over a long span of time, but in a way that does not restrict player power. It makes sense given they were implemented at the same time and thus likely had similar design philosophies, but it is funny that I find one to be a much better addition to the game than the other. And fourthly, it's a pain in the rump to fill out, especially on alts or if changes occur. Granted, it can be kind of fun the first time you do it on a character, but it can also be frustrating wanting to get rolling and having to spend a half hour figuring out what you want to do with what is probably the most complicated talent system we've ever had. And it becomes an absolute slog if your talent trees are changed in any way and you have to reassign talents. Best hope that the changes weren't too invasive, because if so, you'll be repeating much of the process because, let's be real, you don't remember what your 11th alt's full build was. This simply wasn't an issue with the mop talents, which you almost certainly could remember, and even if you didn't, could figure out in no time at all because the choices were much more straightforward. In case you haven't surmised as much, I think the mop talents were the best iteration we've gotten. They were the easiest to understand while offering the most actual choice to players. The only real weakness, in my opinion, was lacking the satisfaction of spending a bunch of points, which was the strong point of vanilla talents. Dragonflight trees, on the other hand, are my least favorite form we've gotten. They aren't so egregiously bad that it ruins my gameplay or anything like that, but I personally would love if we ever returned to the mop style, because to me, the Dragonflight talent trees are just kind of a drag. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Farak the Blazing, simply because, hey, he's a Dragonflight character. But unlike the talent trees, I really like Farak as a character. He is admittedly a very straightforward character. Like, making the fire guy obsessed with power and burning everything down isn't exactly groundbreaking, but also, he's just really fun. He's extremely bombastic, which is a very nice change of pace from the past few expansion big bads we've had, such as Zoval, N'Zoth, Argus, Archimonde. Yeah, really, Garrosh and Mop was probably the last time we had an end boss with actual personality. And he's seriously such a jerkwad. Sorry, Fire Lord, but I would rather watch you die. Keep dreaming, little one. Your mother is not here to save you. How did your protection work out for your children? He's so fun! But he does have a little going on under the hood. His anger is at least somewhat justified. He was the first of the incarnates, but very quickly got bullied out of leadership by Iridikron. And then in Dragonflight, Iridikron basically uses him as a giant distraction and then runs off to do his own thing. And Viranoth, the only other incarnate left that he could rely on, understandably realizes how unhinged he is and decides to jump ship and work against him. And he's obviously not the type of guy to take this sort of stuff in stride. Anyway, Farak sort of has two different color palettes, one before and one after consuming the Shadow Flame. And because I depicted him in the raid, I tried to go more for the Shadow Flame look, but I did dial it back a bit because I just kind of prefer his regular fire form, and he is the fire incarnate, and I wanted to represent that. I obviously gave him Fearlath because that axe looks super sick, and overall I'm pretty satisfied with how he came out, but definitely the hardest part was the sort of lava bits in his flesh, getting those to look right. And I took the simple route and just stuck him at the top of a Myrdersill where you fight him in the raid. It's kind of weird that that platform even exists, but you know, dream logic. Though it would have been nicer if we actually traveled up there instead of just flying through his fire rift thing. But whatever, Farak was a great and entertaining character. Well done, Blizzard. That'll be it for this video, so thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!